one is books. We've written other books and illustrated other books. And we also worked on post-humanism. So we have worked on different conferences together. So please, let's hear this talk.
Thanks a lot for this kind of introduction, Yunus. Actually, yes, what you didn't manage, so my most recent book is actually a book on Nietzsche and human dignity. So I'm drawing on some of Nietzsche's central insights and I'm developing them further and then applying them to contemporary ethical debates. I've been doing this in the field of bioethics, transhumanism and posthumanism, which brought about a massive debate in various journals. And I've been doing this also, my most recent monograph written in German on human dignity after according to Nietzsche, and which implied a vehement criticism of the concept of human dignity as it's present in contemporary legal and moral debates in Germany, but not only in Germany, because the notion of human dignity is a central one in various constitutions worldwide, and it's central one for many bioethical debates in particular. These insights from the book actually brought about a massive debate. There was the Nietzsche Forum in Munich organized a conference dedicated to responses to this book, and now what I'm presenting today is sort of a further development of the basic positions I've been putting forward in the previous works. Now it's mainly focused on a specific aspect of Kant's ethical theory, that the moral prohibition of treating a person solely as a means. And it's this aspect which has been taken over in the legal context of Germany. And that's a central aspect, a legally valid aspect applied in Germany. And I'm drawing upon Nietzschean thinking in order to criticize this aspect. The concept of human dignity is central in many constitutions worldwide. It plays particularly a central role in the German financial law. Kant's concept of dignity is particularly influential in this context. And there are two aspects which German law inherited from Kant, and both of which are highly problematic. Firstly, even though that it's acknowledged by the German constitution that animals are not objects, they are supposed to be treated like objects. Hence, the categorical dualistic separation of animals from human beings is implicitly contained in this judgment. So animals and environment, plants, they still fall under the object law, which still implies such a Cartesian and Kantian dualistic understanding, which I think highly problematic, that this is legally valid. Secondly, it's legally forbidden to treat a person solely as a means. This insight applies both to oneself as well as to other persons, which becomes clear in the following two regulations. Firstly, peep shows in Germany are legally forbidden, even if it's the case that it's the dancer's autonomous wish to earn money in that way. So if someone wants to present themselves within the peep show, and I want to do that, you can't do that, because they're referring to, so peep shows is a way, there are windows and people are sitting behind them. They can see you, but you cannot see them. So German law argues that you are being treated like solely as a means, just like an object, and hence you cannot freely decide, autonomously decide for yourself to make that decision, which is, I think, also a very highly problematic implication. Secondly, it's also forbidden to shoot down hijacked airplanes, even though it seems to fly directly into a nuclear power station, as long as there are innocent persons on board. So it's clear, hijacked airplane, they fly into a nuclear power station, and it's highly likely that everyone will die anyway, and a million other people as well, because of what happened there. So it's not allowed to shoot down such airplanes, because then the state would be treating the people on board solely as a means. In both cases, the regulation was justified by reference to the Kantian thought that it's morally false to treat a person solely as a means. In the following reflections, firstly, I will mention a basic assumption on which this regulation rests. Secondly, I will consider which options follow from these reflections, and thirdly, I will analyze the challenges related to the options mentioned. Thereby, it's supposed to become clear that the German law needs to be altered concerning the moral prohibition of treating a person solely as a means. Challenging Kant's basic assumption. The Kantian moral prohibition of treating a person solely as a means rests on the distinction between persons and things. Persons participate in the world which is governed by the laws of nature and the laws of freedom. Things, however, participate solely in the world which is governed by the laws of nature. This distinction implies that only persons do not solely belong to the natural world. This is in German law, which only human beings would be. Kant doesn't uphold that position, but it's got this implication. Kant did not affirm an anthropocentric conception of personhood, but a logocentric position of personhood, as it was not necessary for him that only human beings are persons. In the German legal context, however, the distinction between persons and things turns into an anthropocentric conception, as only human beings are legally treated as persons. Is this a plausible anthropology today? Is this one which a legal constitution of a liberal democratic state should actually enforce upon all human beings, upon all citizens? Darwin, Nietzsche, and contemporary post-humanist thinkers might have reasons for doubting this position. Given recent biological research, given that human beings and great apes have common ancestors, and given that a basically naturalist, non-dualist understanding of the world applies, it's more plausible to hold that there is merely a gradual difference between human beings, great apes, plants, and maybe even stones. Nietzsche's anthropology provides a possible non-dualist anthropology, which attempts to grasp of related concepts philosophically. Thereby, all entities turn into constellations of power quanta and organisms, and human beings are seen as a specific type of animal. Sometimes he even refers to them as sick animals. However, the sickness in Nietzsche is not necessarily a depreciation of human beings. The aspect of sickness has several implications. It means that they've developed a special capacity, namely the capacity of not immediately having to follow their instincts. This can have both beneficial as well as problematic consequences. It can be beneficial as it enables human beings to create culture, develop technologies, enable them to realize sublimation processes. It can be problematic as it separates acts from the immediate realization of instincts, whereby instincts in many cases, he stresses rightly, are more reliable concerning one's own interest than intellectual reflections. So we come to the second part. We're moving beyond Kant's basic assumptions. As both philosophical and scientific reflections lead us to doubt the Kantian anthropology on which the German foundational law rests, what can be done to take these insights into consideration? It needs to be stressed that it's problematic to refer to the post-humanist and Nietzschean insights as the ones who are generally accepted. This is not the case. In Germany, there are many citizens who still uphold a Christian, dualist understanding of the world, which rather affirms the basic assumptions of Kantian reflections. Still, it needs to be asked whether a social liberal democracy ought to be based upon a premise which affirms a strong metaphysical anthropology, namely one which is most consistent with an anthropology which sees only human beings as being constituted out of a material body and an immaterial soul. Animals, plants, and stones, on the other hand, are regarded as objects and as not participating in any world outside the material naturalist one. This seems to go against the fundamental norm of freedom on which democracies rest. In the case of Germany, it can be said that at least 30% of citizens can be classified as naturalists, skeptics, or atheists, who are being treated paternalistically by this type of legal regulation. Members of the Catholic and Protestant churches, on the other hand, have strong intuitions and hence have an enormous amount of power to influence political decision-making processes. However, given at least 1/3 of the population is treated paternalistically in an aggressive manner by these types of regulations, goes against the central value the normal freedom ought to have within a democracy. Hence, these regulations ought to be revised. What does it imply to revise the related premises of the foundational law? Given that the current implications of the foundational law are such that it has strong metaphysical implications, such that only beings are seen as participating both in the material as well as in the immaterial world, but it's problematic that the foundational law of a democratic society has not strong metaphysical basis, it cannot be an appropriate way of reacting to this insight to simply replace this regulation by another one, such that human beings or animals are merely gradually different, by merely replacing that with a Nietzschean understanding. In this case, one ontology would simply be replaced by another one. Instead of such a substitution, it would be more appropriate to stress the norm of negative freedom whenever the ontological implications of an anthropology become relevant. However, the main question which I intended to address in my talk was primarily the one concerning the prohibition of treating a person solely as a means. So far I described that the Kantian moral prohibition implies the ontological distinction between person and rest. It only upholds if there is such a distinction. Persons have autonomy and hence dignity, which implies that no finite value can be attributed to them. Things, on the other hand, can have a finite amount of value, which is also the reason why they can be treated solely as a means. Persons, on the other hand, cannot be identified with a finite amount of value and consequently must not be treated solely as a means. Hence, the intellectual basis on which Kant's moral prohibition rests is a highly problematic ontological understanding which is currently not shared by at least 1/3 of German citizens. Still, they are forced to be judged on this basis as this regulation is part of the legal system. It has consequences such as a prohibition of peep shows as well as a prohibition to shoot down hijacked airplanes with innocents on board. I mean, strongly paternalistic implications. If the prohibition to treat a person solely as a means rests on the aforementioned ontological basis, the question needs to address which consequences it has concerning this prohibition, given that only one merely sees a gradual difference between human beings, animals, and other entities, as modern science, Nietzsche, and others convincingly were putting forward, or plausibly were putting forward. Two immediate options come to mind. Firstly, due to them being merely a gradual difference, being human beings and other entities, they are normal things, and hence it will have to be morally prohibited to treat any entity merely as a means. Secondly, it can be argued that the prohibition of treating a person solely as a means doesn't even apply today as a universally valid regulation. E.g., for example, if someone has been an offender, he can be put into prison, or he can even be killed in specific circumstances. E.g., if he threatens to kill someone else. Hence, treating a person solely as a means can be both morally legitimate as well as morally illegitimate. If this judgment applies to persons, then it applies also to all other entities, given that there is solely a gradual distinction between all entities in question. I come to the third part, challenges related to these two moves beyond Kant's basic assumption. There were two major suggestions concerning these moves beyond Kant's basic assumptions. Firstly, the moral prohibition to treat persons solely as a means was reinterpreted such that all entities, from stones to great apes and human beings, turned into persons. Secondly, the moral prohibition mentioned was dissolved as a distinction between morally legitimate ways of treating a person solely as a means and morally illegitimate ways of treating persons